In small-town America, there are places where everyone knows your name, places where church bells ring faithfully every Sunday morning, where neighbors wave to each other from their porches, and where trust runs as deep as the roots of century-old trees. Independence, Missouri was one of those places, a town where life moved at a steady, predictable pace, where people believed in God, family, and community. But as you're about to discover, even in the most faithful communities, darkness can hide behind the most trusted faces. This is the true story of Randy Stone, a devoted husband, a loving father, a respected businessman, and a man whose faith in his church would lead to his ultimate betrayal. On June 14, 1967, in Kansas City, Missouri. Born to Leonard and Clara, Randy grew up with strong Midwestern values and an even stronger bond with his mother, Clara. Those who knew him described a man of contrasts, tough on the outside but deeply sensitive within. He was the kind of man who could bench press his own weight at the gym, then come home and write poetry for the woman he loved. After graduating high school in 1986, 18-year-old Randy did what many young men from his generation did. He joined the Marine Corps. For nearly 4 years, he served his country with honor and distinction. But when his service ended, Randy's heart pulled him back home to Kansas City, back to the familiar streets of his childhood, and back to a girl he'd known most of his life. Her name was Teresa Greenawalt. Teresa, born in 1971, was a family friend who lived nearby. The Stones and the Greenawalt families had known each other for years, their lives intertwined through community connections and mutual respect. When Randy returned from the Marines, he and Teresa rekindled their childhood acquaintance. What started as friendship quickly blossomed into something more. Teresa was described by those who knew her as attractive and charismatic, with a flirtatious personality that drew people in. For Randy, she was everything. After just 7 months of dating, the couple married in 1990. Both were devout Christians, so a church wedding wasn't just important, it was essential. It was a promise before God, witnessed by their families and blessed by their faith. Soon after their wedding, their family grew. First came their son, Michael, then their daughter, Miranda. Randy threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything else in his life. He was a devoted dad who never missed a school play, never forgot a birthday, and always put his family first. But Randy wasn't just focused on his family, he was building something bigger. In 1997, he opened his own insurance office in Independence, Missouri, affiliating with Farmers Insurance. For over 13 years, Randy worked tirelessly, becoming known as the most successful insurance agent in the area. He had a gift for numbers, a talent for connecting with people, and an unwavering commitment to doing right by his clients. Teresa worked alongside him, handling administrative tasks and client interactions. Together, they built a life that looked perfect from the outside. They were financially stable, solidly middle class, and by all accounts, deeply in love. Those who saw them together noticed how they weren't shy about showing affection publicly. Randy would hold Teresa's hand at church functions. He'd pull her close during community events. He worshipped her, some would later say. They seemed to have it all. But there was something even more important to Randy and Teresa than their worldly success, something that formed the very foundation of who they were as a couple: faith. It was the foundation of their entire existence. And at the center of that faith was New Hope Baptist Church in Independence, Missouri. Randy wasn't just a member. He was deeply involved. He drove one of the church's Sunday school bus routes, picking up children every week and making sure they got to hear the Word of God. He taught Sunday school classes, sharing biblical lessons with enthusiasm and genuine care. And because Randy was great with numbers and always willing to help, he served as the church's minister of records and sat on the finance committee, ensuring the church's resources were managed responsibly. Teresa contributed in her own ways. She worked in the church kitchen, preparing meals for fellowship dinners. She sang in the choir, her voice rising with the congregation's hymns. She organized church events, bringing people together in celebration of their shared faith. The Stone family was, by all measures, the kind of family every church hopes to have in their congregation. But there was another family equally devoted to New Hope Baptist Church, the family of Pastor David Love. David Love was born on March 13, 1960, into a family of missionaries. Ministry wasn't just his calling, it was his heritage. His entire family had been dedicated to spreading the gospel for generations. After high school, David pursued higher education and eventually entered the ministry, becoming the pastor of New Hope Baptist Church in 1999 at the age of 38. Pastor Love was known for his engaging sermons and charismatic personality. He had a way of making Scripture come alive, of making people feel seen and understood. Members of the congregation looked up to him, trusted him, confided in him. David was married to Kim Love, whom he'd met in college. They tied the knot on June 26, 1982, and together they had 3 children. Kim was described as talkative with a lush Southern accent, a devoted wife and mother who supported her husband's pastoral duties and maintained an active presence in church activities. From the outside, the Loves appeared to be the perfect pastoral family. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving. Before coming to New Hope Baptist Church, Pastor Love had served at a congregation in Virginia. Details about his time there remain limited, but sources suggest his departure wasn't entirely voluntary. There were whispers of financial disputes, of money that couldn't be accounted for. Reportedly, $30,000 had gone missing, and despite attempts to explain the discrepancy, David couldn't provide satisfactory answers. Eventually, he resigned. But in Independence, Missouri, at New Hope Baptist Church, nobody knew about Virginia. Or if they did, they chose to believe in second chances and redemption. After all, isn't that what the church is supposed to be about? Kim Love would later recall that, in the beginning of their marriage, David treated her like a queen. But over time, something changed. She found herself having to be wary of other women in the congregation, women who were clearly interested in the handsome pastor. And more troubling, David didn't always seem indifferent to their attention. Kim had a particular sense about one woman in the congregation, a woman who seemed to have caught her husband's eye more than the others. That woman was Teresa Stone. The first sign that something was wrong came in 2004. Teresa became pregnant. It should have been a moment of joy, a blessing to celebrate. But there was one problem that couldn't be ignored. Randy had undergone a vasectomy. For most men, this revelation would have triggered immediate suspicion, anger, confrontation. But Randy Stone wasn't most men. He was a man who loved his wife unconditionally, who trusted her completely. Randy convinced himself that the pregnancy was still his. After all, he reasoned, vasectomies aren't always 100% effective, and he had missed his follow-up appointment after the procedure. Surely, that meant pregnancy was still possible. Randy chose to believe. Tragically, Teresa miscarried. The pregnancy ended, and with it, any definitive answers about paternity. But the questions didn't end. By 2008, those questions had grown too loud to ignore. Randy made a decision that shocked those close to him. He announced that he intended to resign from New Hope Baptist Church. The reason? Randy believed that Pastor David Love and his wife Teresa were having an affair. When Randy shared his suspicions with someone he trusted, they tried to talk him out of it. They assured him that his accusations were ridiculous. Teresa loved him deeply. Anyone could see that. And Pastor Love? He was a man of God. He would never betray his congregation, his calling, his faith in such a devastating way. People trusted David Love. They respected him. They thought well of him. Faced with such reassurances, Randy began to doubt his own instincts. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe his suspicions were unfounded. So Randy stayed at the church. He kept his family intact. He tried to rebuild trust. And in a cruel irony, when Teresa caught Randy watching adult films, it was Pastor David Love who offered to help. David suggested weekly counseling sessions, private meetings where Randy could work through his struggles, where David could guide him back to righteousness. Randy agreed. He submitted himself to counseling with the very man he had suspected of destroying his marriage. Those counseling sessions would continue for 2 years. 2 years of Randy sitting across from David Love, confessing his weaknesses, seeking spiritual guidance, trying to be a better husband. 2 years while David and Teresa's affair continued in secret. March 31st, 2010, started like any other day in Independence, Missouri. The sun rose over the quiet streets. People went to work. Children went to school. Teresa Stone arrived at her husband's insurance office that afternoon. Immediately, something felt wrong. The blinds in Randy's office were closed. That was unusual. Randy typically only drew the blinds once it got dark outside. But there they were, shut tight in the middle of the day. Randy's car was parked outside, so he had to be there. But when Teresa tried the front door, she found it locked. That was even more unusual. The office should have been open. Staff should have been working. Teresa used her key to enter. She called out for her husband. No response. She searched the storage room. Everything appeared normal, but Randy was nowhere to be found. A knot of worry began forming in her stomach as she made her way toward her own office. What Teresa saw next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Randy lay motionless on the floor, completely lifeless. Blood was everywhere. It had pooled around his head, soaked into the carpet, splattered on the walls. Randy Stone was dead. For a moment, though it might have been seconds or might have been minutes, Teresa stood frozen. Then instinct took over. She grabbed the office phone, but she didn't call 911. Instead, she called her parents. Randy's been shot. He's dead. Her parents immediately told her to call 911. Teresa did, but when the emergency dispatcher answered, Teresa's story changed. She didn't mention a shooting. Instead, she repeatedly told the operator that something had happened to her husband, that he was unresponsive, that she didn't know what to do. She mentioned blood coming from his ear, but claimed she didn't know what had caused it. The dispatcher instructed Teresa to wait outside for emergency responders. But Teresa didn't wait alone for long. Within minutes, Kim Love, the pastor's wife, arrived. And then, Pastor David Love himself appeared. When police officers arrived and began securing the scene, they asked David to take the distraught Teresa away, but Kim offered to do it instead. David agreed and left with Teresa's parents. Inside Randy's office, investigators began their work. What they found painted a grim picture. Randy had been shot in the back of the head. There were no signs of a struggle. The killer had come up behind him, likely while Randy was working at his desk, and executed him with a single shot. There was no murder weapon at the scene. Money on Randy's desk remained untouched, immediately ruling out robbery as a motive. This wasn't a random crime. This was personal. This was planned. Something about this case felt different from the start. Randy had been shot with a .22 caliber handgun, a weapon that, investigators would later discover, belonged to Randy himself. The killer had taken the gun from the Stone family home, used it to murder Randy, and then disposed of it. This wasn't the work of a stranger. This was someone who had access to Randy's life, his home, his routines. The detectives began interviewing those closest to Randy, and at every turn, one name kept appearing in connection with Teresa Stone, Pastor David Love. Multiple people mentioned that they'd seen Teresa and David spending time together, often in ways that seemed inappropriate for a pastor and a married parishioner. Some had noticed lingering glances. Others had observed private conversations that seemed too intimate. But the most damning information came from phone records. Investigators discovered extensive communication between Teresa Stone and David Love. In the days leading up to Randy's murder, they had exchanged numerous calls and text messages. The volume and timing of their communication raised immediate red flags. They brought Teresa in for questioning, and it was during these interviews that the facade began to crack. At first, Teresa maintained that she and David were just friends, that he had been providing her with pastoral counseling. But as the evidence mounted, her story shifted. She admitted that, yes, she and David had grown close. Very close. The affair, Teresa eventually revealed, had been going on for approximately 10 years. It had started innocently enough, or, so she claimed, just close friends, good friends. The kind of friendship that can develop between a pastor and a parishioner who spends a lot of time at church. But over the years, that friendship had evolved. It became sexual. And then, Teresa admitted with tears streaming down her face, it became love. For 10 years, they had stood in the house of God, sung hymns, prayed prayers, and preached about morality while living a lie. But the investigation revealed something even more sinister. Teresa told investigators that David had talked about getting rid of their spouses, not just leaving them, not just divorce, getting rid of them permanently. The plan, according to Teresa, was for David to murder both Randy Stone and his own wife, Kim Love. Then they could be together without the complications of divorce, without splitting assets, without explaining to their children why mommy and daddy didn't love each other anymore. It was, in the most horrifying sense, a final solution. With Teresa's confession, the investigation shifted focus entirely to David Love. But when police went to bring him in for questioning, they discovered that the pastor had vanished. David Love had fled. He'd packed up his family and driven to South Carolina, where he found work as a truck driver, trying to blend into anonymity. But in the digital age, anonymity is nearly impossible to maintain. Police traced his movements through cell phone records and financial transactions, piecing together a digital trail that revealed exactly where he'd been hiding. Tips from acquaintances who recognized him confirmed the investigators' suspicions, narrowing the search to a specific location in South Carolina. On April 15, 2010, just 2 weeks after Randy Stone's murder, officers found David Love. There was no dramatic chase, no shootout, just the calm execution of a carefully planned arrest. David Love was taken into custody and brought back to Missouri to face justice. 8 months after Randy's death, Facing mounting pressure and the very real possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison, Teresa Stone decided to tell the whole truth. She revealed how David had come into possession of the gun that killed Randy. She admitted that she had given David the keys to their house. She had provided him with the code to the gun safe where Randy kept his firearms. She had supplied information about Randy's movements, his schedule, when he would be alone at the office. And investigators recovered a message from Teresa that would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. "I want him dead." 4 words that changed everything, 4 words that demonstrated premeditation, conspiracy, intent to murder. Teresa Stone hadn't just carried on an affair, she hadn't just stood by while her husband was killed. She had actively participated in planning his murder. The only reason Teresa agreed to testify, prosecutors believed, was the hope of receiving a lighter sentence. With her cooperation, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. David Love had been counseling Randy Stone for 2 years. 2 years of private sessions where Randy confessed his fears, his insecurities, his suspicions. And David had used every piece of that information to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately plan Randy's execution. Faced with overwhelming evidence, David Love chose to accept a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The plea spared him the uncertainty of a trial and the possibility of a first-degree murder conviction, which could have carried the death penalty. The court sentenced him to life in prison with eligibility for parole only after serving 25 years. For her cooperation with authorities and detailed testimony about the planning and execution of the crime, Teresa received a reduced sentence of 8 years in prison. During the investigation, Teresa revealed something else that sent chills through everyone involved in the case. She told investigators that David had once contemplated killing his own wife, Kim Love. He had discussed a detailed plan to murder Kim and stage her death as an accident, breaking her neck and pushing her car down an embankment. Fortunately, that plan was never carried out. Kim Love had come within a breath of becoming another victim of her husband's murderous schemes. In a 2013 interview with ABC News, Kim Love and her 3 children sat down to discuss the unimaginable betrayal they had experienced. Remarkably, they said they held no animosity toward David despite everything he had done. They emphasized their focus on healing and moving forward rather than living in anger or resentment. Kim has since divorced David and remarried, building a new life away from the shadow of her former husband's crimes. Clara Stone, Randy's mother, spoke with a voice heavy with sorrow about the son she had lost. She described Randy as a man who worshipped his wife, a devoted father and husband whose love for Teresa never wavered. "He loved her until the day he died," Clara said, her words echoing the profound heartbreak that had overtaken their family. When Teresa was sentenced to 8 years in prison for her role in the murder, Clara didn't hide the pain and devastation the ordeal had caused. The image of a happy, loving family had been shattered, replaced by betrayal, deceit, and unimaginable grief. Michael and Miranda, Randy and Teresa's children, eventually made the difficult decision to forgive their mother. They said they had already lost their father and didn't want to lose her too. It's a grace that many people couldn't understand, but for them, it was the only way forward. Records indicate that David Love remains incarcerated at the Southeast Correctional Center in Charleston, Missouri. He will be eligible for parole in 2036, at which point he will be 76 years old. After serving her 8-year sentence, Teresa was released and began a new life. Reports indicate that she now lives with a new partner in Kansas City, Missouri, keeping a low profile and staying out of the public eye. The story of Randy Stone is a tragedy in every sense of the word. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the face of a trusted friend. Sometimes it hides behind a minister's collar. Sometimes it stands beside you in church, singing hymns and speaking the language of faith while planning betrayal in the darkness. Randy Stone was a good man. He was devoted to his family, committed to his community, and faithful to his beliefs. He loved deeply and trusted completely. Those qualities, which should have been his greatest strengths, became the instruments of his downfall. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.